When I was around 15 years old, I lived with just my mom, and I had the entire floor as my room. Imagine a small loft with a door enclosing the room and a big skylight in the ceiling. It was a really cool room, but I digress. My friends and I had started messing around with the occult, doing little rituals and Ouija boards, typical teenage girl stuff. Or maybe my friends and I were just weird. Nothing ever happened with the Ouija board, but when it did move, I was convinced from my friends giggling that one of them was moving it. It never spelled anything out coherently anyway. One night, after my friends had left and I was tucked into bed, I fell into a really deep REM sleep. I was probably asleep for 3 hours before I got the most insane adrenaline surge I've ever had in my life, and I've been in rollover accidents on the freeway. So I mean it when I say I got shocked out of REM sleep with my own adrenaline, and it was immediately terrifying. I don't know how, but I knew I was being watched. I laid there with an increased heartbeat and my eyes closed out of fear because I was so confused and alarmed at what had woken me up like this, with no nightmares I could remember or sounds in my room in the dead of night. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open my eyes. I want to preface this by saying I'm not religious. I'm a skeptic, and still not sure if I believe in ghosts. But what I saw still sends a weird feeling into my gut when I remember it to this day. I opened my eyes, and laying horizontally on my bed, and right in front of my face, was a little boy, crouched on his knees, maybe 6 inches away from my face. It was admittedly very hard to see him. My room was sparsely lit from little moonlight, but I remember he had black hair and black eyes and a grayish complexion, but that could have just been the moonlight. What gets me though is the second I saw him, his expression went from neutral to pure terror, like he was so incredibly scared that I could see him. Then this fucking thing, or figment of my imagination, I'll never know, leaned back on his elbows, fucking crab walked back into the shadows of my room, behind the illumination of the skylight. I tell people this story all the time. This is not creative writing. I sat there in the most insane fear I've ever had, to this day, for what felt like centuries. It was probably around an hour before I got up the courage to scream bloody murder from my mom downstairs. My mom used to tease me about it because, of course, she didn't find anything. She named the ghost Kevin, and we started blaming missing things or random stuff happening on Kevin. She thought it was funny, and I played along. But I will never forget what I saw. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made the possibility of it being a dream completely nil. It was so damn weird, and I'll think about it until the day I die. This is going to sound really stupid, but I have no idea what I saw to this day. I have a few theories, but I'm not sure. I had been working at this burrito place for a few years. It was this big, almost abandoned shopping center in the middle of the city. It used to be full of thriving businesses, but since 2007, they've all gone out of business, except for the burrito place and an ice cream parlor that was right next to it, and a Tuesday morning. A lot of homeless people sleep there, but other than that, it's usually quiet. This happened after hours. I was working the night shift, like usual, and I was taking out the trash. When I pushed the cart outside and came around to the back alley, I saw something that I couldn't explain. It was crouched down on all fours, about 5 feet across, by the door of the compactor/dumpster. It had grayish tan skin. It was thin, with its spine protruding, and it had a small, almond-shaped head. It had 4 limbs, as far as I could tell, but they were bent like spider legs. I didn't get a good enough look at its feet. It either had two long slits for eyes, or they were closed. I didn't see a mouth or a nose. I immediately pushed the cart and ran back inside. I stood there a minute and thought that maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, and I was just getting freaked out for no reason. After calming myself down, I went back out there. The trash cart was still there, and when I came around the corner, I saw the creature again. It was sitting there, motionless. I was so scared and confused that I ran again and told my manager what I saw and asked her to come with me. Of course, this time it was gone, and she thought I was making it up. What's weird to me is that it was just sitting there. It wasn't moving or making any sounds. I tried looking up what this could be, but I found nothing. Do any of you have any idea?
So when I was a kid, maybe 6 or 7, and this was in the mid-1990s, we took a family trip to the beach in Florida. We were staying in a beach house, a short walking distance from the beach. We went to the beach, and I was supposed to stay inside of my mom, but I wandered way down, and before I knew it, I was lost. A lot of the houses looked the same, and I wasn't sure which one was ours, and I couldn't see my mom anywhere. And then, it started to rain. I came to a path that I was pretty sure led back to our house, but it didn't lead to a house at all, but instead, to a parking lot. There was this big, dirty van parked there. It was the only vehicle around. I was about to turn back when I noticed an overweight woman with brown hair, a hot pink tank top, and those big, clunky thick glasses that were popular in the 80s, waving and smiling at me from the passenger seat of the van. She said something like, "Oh my, it's raining. Where's your mommy? Let us take you to her. It's dangerous to be out here in the rain. You could get struck by lightning." She was very friendly, almost overly so. In the driver's seat was a very overweight man without a shirt on, a hairy gray chest, and some clunky looking gold chain. He was wearing yellow tinted Elvis shades and staring at me very intently. He was also smoking a cigarette, which I knew was bad. The woman stepped out of the van and kneeled down to me. She asked how old I was. When I told her, she gleefully remarked, "Oh my, we have 2 boys your age at our house. You should come over and spend the night. We've got movies, Nintendo, and in the morning we've got all kinds of cereal." I had been taught about stranger danger, but at this point in my life, no adult had ever given me any reason not to trust them. The lady continued talking about stuff, like how the boys have go-karts, and how they like to drink chocolate milk. She made it seem very enticing for a 7-year-old kid, and at this point, I trusted her. I mostly liked the idea of getting to play with some kids my age. Then, I remembered that I needed to ask my mom first, and I told her this. She told me that it was no problem, that they just live up the road, and that my mom shouldn't mind. It started raining harder, and she opened the sliding door of the van and said something like, "Now, let's get you out of this rain and go find your mommy." I knew logically I shouldn't do this, but the lady seemed really nice, and I was desperately wanting to get out of the rain. As I walked toward the open door of the van, I noticed an awful stench that almost made me gag. This set off alarm bells in my head that something wasn't right. There were cigarette butts all over the floor. I looked up at the fat man, who was not only staring at me with this menacing glare, but he had this really creepy, toothy smile, and his teeth were stained a dark yellow. I could pick up on a very fucked up vibe from him. I knew now that I should run, but the woman was ushering me to hurry and get in. And then, her demeanor changed. She was being demanding and trying to literally push me into the van. She sounded angry and said, "Get in already!" in a tone that was the complete opposite of how she sounded before. I jumped to the side and started running as fast as I could. The woman managed to grab my arm or wrist, but somehow I was able to quickly break free and run back to the beach. I think she tried to chase me, but like I said, she was very overweight. I made it back to my mom, who was freaking out. I tried explaining what had happened, but I don't think that at 7 years old I was able to convey the gravity of what had happened, and I didn't fully understand it myself.
So this happened sometime in April of 2019. I live in a decent-sized city in the western US. And my job at the time was in a restaurant where I worked late nights, sometimes until 1 a.m. The job wasn't far from my apartment, so I would walk back every night. My place was in kind of a rundown part of town. Imagine a lot of abandoned lots. Basically, at that time of night, there would be no one around except people like me who were making their way home. So, I'm walking down the road leading up to my place one night. I'm looking down at my phone, and when I lift my head up, I see these two kids, probably like 40 or 50 feet away. And they were holding hands and walking in my direction. This was odd, because the road is a pretty straight shot. There wouldn't have been many alleys or side streets for them to come out of, unless they were just hanging out in one of the empty lots. They were too far away to make out any details, but I was sure that they had to be young kids. This on its own was unsettling, but the way they started behaving after this was what sent me into fuck this shit mode. These two stepped off the curb, looked both ways, and crossed the street. But there was no need to do that on a completely deserted road. But I thought, whatever, kids are taught to look both ways before crossing. That would have been fine. Except, after walking maybe 10 more feet, they stepped off again, looked both ways, and crossed back over the side that they were just on. They did this 4 or 5 times until they were right in front of me. I could tell at this point it was a boy who looked to be about 13 and a girl who looked to be about 9. Their clothing wasn't exactly like other black-eyed kid encounters I've heard, where they're wearing old-timey rags. Instead, they just had these gray pajama-looking things and white shoes with no logo or brand. Now, I'm a pretty big dude. I'm about 6'1", 240 pounds. I've been stopped and fucked with by all kinds of junkies and weirdos, and always thought I could handle myself. Despite all this, I felt terrified of these two little kids. They came up to me, and even though their eyes weren't solid black, their pupils seemed to be very dark, and they almost had a glow to them. They stopped dead in front of me, and the boy said, "We're lost. Our parents must be worried," in a straight monotone voice. You'd think that 2 lost children in the ghetto at 1 a.m. would be frantic and crying. The girl then chimed in, "We need to use the phone at your house. Our parents must be worried," in the same matter-of-fact way. I told them they could use my cell phone, or I could call the police. They didn't say anything, and the boy just said, "Our parents are worried." I don't know of any other situation where I would leave 2 kids there defenseless, but something in my gut told me to get the fuck out of there. So I just walked past them. After about a block, I looked back and saw them continuing in the other direction, repeatedly crossing the street again. It was one of the most unsettling things that I've ever experienced. My boyfriend and I are travelers and live in our van. I am from upstate New York and he's from Manhattan. I've been living like this for over 5 years now and have seen a lot. One of the best parts about this lifestyle is the people you get to meet from all walks of life all over the world. Needless to say, we have had a lot of exposure to different people, and we aren't easily scared by strange behavior or differences. A lot of times, we will camp in national forests, but there are also plenty of nights we spend in Walmart parking lots and Home Depots, and anywhere we can find with overnight street parking. The latter has brought us to some sketchy areas, where other homeless people camp in bum camps and whatnot, and obviously hardcore drug use in some of these areas is a real thing. With that being said, a few weeks ago, we were kicking it in Denver, and went downtown to the Rhino District, off of Larimar, I believe, and we're looking at the murals and street art and taking pictures and generally just chilling. It was almost midnight, and we ended up in an alley behind an old Catholic church when we saw the feet and blankets of someone sleeping in the doorway. Now, as another person on the street, even though I don't live the exact same lifestyle as people who have to sleep super public like that, I still empathize as much as possible and try to give them respect and privacy. Like, I don't grill them while they're laying there because I can imagine how uncomfortable and demeaning that would be to wake up to. So as we begin to pass this person, I keep in the forefront of my mind not to stare, and I prepare myself that they might be asleep or they might be awake and looking at us, and not to get startled. This person was laying in a maybe 3-foot indent in front of an entrance to an old factory behind this Catholic church. No matter how prepared I try to get myself, and no matter how much exposure I have to other people on the street, I could not help but get a surge of adrenaline and fear when we passed by this lady. As we got closer, I glanced over and she was sitting up, slouched in the corner, looking right at us. To me, she looked like she could have been native or Hispanic. Her skin was a mix of brown and gray, and she had long, tangled black hair. But what I remember most is her eyes. They were huge and bugged out, and seemed like they were painfully strained, and you could see her lips pull back to show her teeth effortlessly. She had a blank expression on her face the whole time we walked by. I feel like this is a good place to mention that after spending time on the West Coast, you get crazy accustomed to tweakers and general meth antics. You can usually always tell when someone has lost themselves to meth, and it is a special kind of crazy, but crazy all the same. You can feel when someone has lost themselves to this drug, and the decaying and neglect of their bodies is very apparent. With that being said, this woman did not give off druggy vibes. She didn't look ill and frail because of drug use, and she didn't seem to be fueled by drugs. She genuinely looked sick, like terminally ill type sick. The most fucked up part of this is what she said to us as we walked by. Shane was on my left side, my little husky was clipped to me in between us, and the lady was sitting on the ground to my right. And as we passed by, and I noticed she was making eye contact, I gave her a soft, gentle smile and looked down. I don't know what Shane did to her as far as facial expressions and acknowledgement goes, but as we started to pass her, she says in a soft, serious voice with no inflection at all, "What is it called when you don't believe in God anymore?" And Shane quickly responded, "I think that's agnostic." And we just kept walking. As soon as we got out of earshot, I was like, "Shane, what the fuck? Why did that scare me so much?" And he was like, "You're okay. It was just a homeless person. It's no big deal." I had a feeling she was going to scare you though, but it's okay. And we kept walking down the alley. At this point, I let Boppy, my husky, off her clip so she could walk on her own, and she just followed behind us quietly. She never barked throughout the whole ordeal or acted scared at all, and she's losing her eyesight a bit, but I have seen it heighten her other senses. And she knows when things are fucked up, or if someone wants to hurt us, and will bark and go into defense mode. She went through this whole encounter with nothing. We leave the alley and are in front of these old apartment buildings that remind us of something you'd see in New York or even New Orleans. Totally project looking, almost shotgun houses, and completely out of place for gentrified ass Denver.
We saw them as we drove by before this happened, and instantly felt drawn to them because they were so out of place. There was a kid's jungle gym placed on top of a bush in front of a house, which was distinct as fuck, but we didn't mention it until later. And there was a haze of a flashing TV screen, and someone screaming in one of the houses through the open door. And this was all across the street from the old ominous Catholic church. It was just the dark alley, the lady, the creepy church, the foreign houses, the supposed presence of children, and the soft hazy lighting from the streetlight above that was such a mindfuck that it didn't feel like we were in Denver anymore. Or, I hate to be this guy, but like we weren't in 2020 anymore. Later on that night, we got back to the van, and Shane told me that woman actually terrified him, and that he knew I was scared, but had to act like everything was okay for me so I didn't lose my shit. He said it was just as unnatural as I felt, and that he doesn't think we saw a person. When he said that, I flipped out, because that's exactly what I thought too. It was unsettling how we both felt the same thing at the same time, and didn't realize it until later on when we discussed the situation. This happened in Venice, California. So last night, we were sleeping in the van by the dog park near the boardwalk, and Shane was staying up doing some art stuff in the van. The way our van is set up is on the left side we have a big long window, and then the driver's side window uncovered. Shane heard someone's feet shuffling and dragging, and was curious which tweaker was walking by, and looked out the window to see someone passing by. This was about 2 a.m., and he saw a lady wearing a black beach hat resting on top of her head, with really thin balding hair, so much that you could see her scalp underneath. She turned her head to the side and tried to look through the big window, and it felt like she could see through the window, but simultaneously not looking at anything in particular. Her eyes were really deep set and sunken in, and it seemed like she hadn't slept in a while, but she didn't seem to be on any drugs. Her skin was pale white, and she seemed to be in her 70s or so. She was really frail and dressed to go to the beach, which was strange because it was so late at night, dark, and chilly for Venice at nighttime. It felt like she wanted people to think that she was going to the beach. She was talking to herself, but it wasn't audible, and was no human language he's ever heard. It sounded like radio tuning or something, like a strange frequency of radio tuning. She didn't notice him, even though they were a few feet away from each other, and she wasn't angry or anything like that. It just felt like she was trying to deceive him. The craziest part is there's a plastic divider in between the two windows, and when she walked away from the big picture window, Shane could hear her footsteps, but she never passed by the front window. She didn't cross the street or go behind the van or anything. She walked straight, and he never saw her past the second window. I'm so glad I wasn't awake for this shit, because I would have totally lost it. As soon as I woke up in the middle of the night, and he told me what happened, I instantly got chills. I don't know what to think about this at all, but I would love to hear your theories. Thanks for listening. This story is definitely going to be hard to believe, but it's 100% true. It's a story that I've told very few people in real life, because I know how crazy it sounds. I know people here have had weird experiences too, and a lot of you know more about folklore and entities than I do. Hopefully, some of you can help explain what I saw. I'd love to hear your theories. This occurred when I was 11 or 12. I'm 28 now, and I was staying the night at my friend Danny's house, who lived just a few houses down from mine. There was a large pond behind our neighborhood, and we spent a lot of time there growing up. We go fishing, ride bikes, explore the small forest, etc. But we really enjoyed catching turtles and tree frogs. It might sound weird, but what can I say? We had somewhat of an obsession with reptiles and amphibians. Another thing I should note is that there's an old Native American trail that went through the backyards on our street. It wasn't the Trail of Tears, but it was related to it in some way. I don't really remember. Back to the story. I was up late playing video games with Danny, And after a while, we wanted to do something else. It was close to midnight, but we decided to go out and try catching some tree frogs. A family that lived in a nearby house had gone on vacation, and they had a perfect backyard for catching frogs. We hopped their fence and started exploring. Almost immediately, I started getting a weird feeling. I had the feeling we were being watched, or something was nearby, and there was this odd energy in the air. I don't really know how to explain it, but something just felt off. I remember feeling afraid, but I had no reason to be. We had done this kind of thing many times before, and it never inspired fear. About 10 minutes in, we thought we could hear the frog saying "help me" in a croaky, froggy voice, over and over again. The weird thing was, we couldn't see any tree frogs with our flashlights, and the yard wasn't that big. They started chanting in unison, and that made it much louder. Feeling more than a little creeped out, we bolted out of there and back to the street. Now, we were standing under a streetlight on the street corner across from where the frog house was. I looked up at the light and noticed at least 15 dragonflies attached to each other like a human centipede. They were all doing a spiraling motion as they flew closer and closer to the light. It was weird. So, we heard and saw two unusual things, but you could possibly explain them away. What happened next, however, made absolutely zero fucking sense. After the dragonflies did their thing and flew away, Danny and I remained standing under that streetlight. We began talking about the strangeness of the frogs in particular. We both heard them croaking the same phrase, and we were pretty much just saying what the fuck was that about. At some point during the conversation, I was instantly overcome with the most intense adrenaline rush that I've ever had in my life. That feeling of fear without a source while at the frog house was back, but much, much stronger. It was like my fight or flight response was signaled for no reason. Once again, everything felt off, and it felt like there was an intense energy all around us, making the air heavy. I was terrified, and I found out later my buddy was feeling the same thing. I became as still as possible, listening intently to my surroundings. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I suddenly began to feel drawn to look at the street behind me. I knew something was there. Whatever was behind me was the source of my fear, and it was putting out overwhelming energy with its presence alone. I hesitantly turned around and looked. A side note, I have full-body goosebumps just recalling this. In the middle of the street, about 20 yards away from us, there was an ordinary-looking 5 to 7-year-old girl with long, dark black hair wearing a white nightgown. She was sitting Indian style on the street pavement with a doll in her lap, and she was combing the doll's hair with a hairbrush. I was pretty much terrified beyond imagination. I was frozen with fear and could barely think straight. There was an incredible amount of energy in the air, and I knew something wasn't natural. She looked innocent enough, but I felt like she could snap me in half with the snap of her fingers if she really wanted to. Another creepy detail was that she never even looked at us. She kept her head down and focused on her doll, but she definitely knew that we were watching her. After what felt like an hour, realistically, probably 15 to 30 seconds, a car turned onto the street and began heading down the hill toward the girl. I remember the headlights getting brighter and brighter as it approached her. You would think maybe I would try to save her real quick, but I legitimately couldn't move. Also, I didn't really expect her to get hit for some reason. I never felt like she was in any sort of danger. Eventually, she became lost in the car's headlights, never looking up from her doll this whole time, by the way, and the car just passed right through her without any sound of a collision. It stopped at the stop sign 15 feet from us and made a right turn. We took our eyes off of where the girl was as we watched the car turn. When we looked back to where the girl had been, she was gone. Instead, there was a dog on the sidewalk, precisely parallel to where the girl was sitting in the street. The dog was looking right at me when I noticed it, almost like it was waiting for me to see it. Then, it just turned around and trotted up the hill in the other direction. After a few seconds, the shock wore off and we sprinted back to Danny's house and spent half the night looking out his second-story window toward the street. I don't know what I saw, but Danny saw the exact same thing. I've always felt like there was a reason it happened, or a reason it showed itself, whatever it was, to us of all people. Last thing, the house in front of where the girl was seen was haunted. I lived on that street for 10 years, and 4 or 5 different families lived in the haunted house during those 10 years. All of them said it was haunted. I have a couple stories about that too, but this is already way longer than I wanted it to be. Anyway, thanks for listening if you made it this far. Please let me know if you have any theories on my experience. When I was a kid, my parents and I lived in a small mobile home in a plot that was across the street from the local cemetery. Although I don't remember much about living there, my parents and other family members have told me the stories. I do remember my dad and mom arguing in the middle of the night one time. I remember my dad asking my mom, "Why are you washing clothes at this hour at night?" My mom arguing back that she wasn't, but we could hear the washer and dryer running. I remember coming home and my parents freaking out because all the cabinets and drawers were open. They assumed someone broke into the house, but nothing was ever missing. I do remember one night, multiple shadows entering my room and standing over my bed. I remember thinking it was my parents until moments later, the lights turned on and my mom walked in to check on me. I was so freaked out that I never slept in my own bed again until I was about 9 years old. There's a scene in The Fourth Kind that made me have a breakdown because it felt like a flashback. These are the things I do remember. The rest of this story was told to me by my parents, grandparents, church pastor, and was actually filed in a police report. One night, my parents were outside having a few drinks, and I was inside watching TV. I must have been around 5 or 6 years old. Suddenly, my parents heard me crying and in pain and ran into the house to see what was happening. They saw me hunched over and crying and screaming. My mom ran to me and started asking what was wrong. Then she lifted my shirt to see if something was biting me. There was nothing, but my skin was being pulled in pinches as if it were rubber. My parents were panicked and ran to get the phone to call for help. The moment my dad reached for the phone, the pinching stopped, and the front door slammed open as if something had just ran out. My dad then ran outside to see if he could see anything, but nothing was there. Suddenly, he started hearing a sort of growling coming from under the mobile home. When he looked, all he could see was some red, bloodshot eyes staring out at him and growling. My dad, in a complete panic, pulled out his gun and started shooting at whatever it was. This caught the attention of a police officer who pulled up in front of the house and pulled his gun out on my dad. My dad quickly dropped his gun and told the officer, "Hey, I'm sorry, but something just attacked my son and it's under the trailer." Before the officer could even look, a creature jumped out from under the mobile home, jumped the fence, and started running. The police officer jumped back into his car and started chasing it. At this point, my parents were completely frightened. Since they had no car at the time, they called a friend of my dad and asked them for a ride to my grandparents' house. Once the friend got there, my dad loaded us into the car and was getting ready to leave when the police officer returned. The officer told my parents, "I followed that thing for about half a mile and it just vanished. I don't know what that was, but I suggest you leave the area for the time being, in case it returns." My mom said she had never heard a police officer sound so terrified in her life. As we were driving down the road, my dad's friend looked at the rearview mirror and asked my parents, "Hey, do you guys see that thing running after us? What the fuck is that?" At that very point, the truck jumped as if something had just landed on the cargo bed. My mom started yelling in pain as the back of her hand was being pinched and pulled, just as my skin had been earlier. This continued until my parents reached my grandparents' property. Now, my grandparents have always been super religious. They're one of the founding members of their church, and they used to host Sunday Mass at their home before the church had enough saved to buy a building. The moment my mom walked into the front gate, the pinching and pulling stopped. My parents ran into my grandparents' home screaming and crying. My grandparents assumed that my parents were either drunk or on some kind of drug, but once they saw the look in all of our eyes, they decided to call the pastor immediately. As soon as pastor arrived, her first words were, "I don't know what's going on, and I don't want to panic you, but I feel something extremely hostile right outside of this home." They immediately started praying. My mom said she opened her eyes during the first prayer and looked outside the window and could see red, bloodshot eyes staring into the house. That night, my mom also claims that during the middle of the night, she awoke and heard 3 knocks on the window. She said she could see outside the window a tall creature walking back and forth right outside of the gate. She said she thought it was odd, almost as if the creature couldn't enter the property. After that night, things apparently calmed down, and nothing really weird happened in that trailer again. Although, my parents did move out a few months later. But even the renters and the people who now live there claim nothing has happened to them. But something is definitely there, and it remembers us. My parents drove past it one night, and they saw 3 dogs jump from out of the cemetery and perch themselves like birds on the fence, watching our car drive by. I had my first ever car accident on the same street, in front of the cemetery too. I suddenly lost control of my car and crashed into a gas pipe. My grandmother has since passed and was buried in that cemetery, and since then, nothing has happened. I like to think she's putting those creatures in their place, acting as a guardian angel.
I found it in a box of old VHS tapes I picked up from a flea market. I hunt for deals there. Sellers are often just looking to unload the crap that sits around off their hands. I buy in bulk, then check the goods, tossing out duds and ensuring items work, are clean and include the necessary pieces, before jacking the price and selling them on eBay. Videotapes are usually a minimal profit at best, but I've found rare items, first releases, Black Diamond Edition Disneys, and rare cover versions that collectors eat up. At any rate, I picked up a large box of tapes that looked to be in great condition for $5, and it wasn't until I got home that I started checking them thoroughly. When I did, I found a standard black video cassette tape missing a box. Normally, these don't interest me because they're usually unsaleable. Secondly, this had no standard label, so it was likely some home movie. What stopped me from tossing it right then and there was the black strip punch label stuck to the back that read 23-2-11 in blocky white raised numbers. I suspected from the dating system it was European, and when it didn't play on my NTSC VCR, that confirmed it. I huffed as I returned to my closet and fetched the European PAL deck. It was only 6 p.m. and I had time to kill, so I popped the tape into my old VHS player and pressed play. The footage was black and white, shot high up from the center of a room where the wall met the ceiling. The camera was pointed down to a thin woman hunched over in a wheelchair. Based on the angle and the stillness of the footage, it was clearly a surveillance feed. The footage was grainy, but I could see the seated woman looking disheveled. Her gray chin-length hair was matted and messy, and she appeared to be dressed in a filthy hospital gown. The way the woman was positioned looked still and unnatural. I quickly realized her wrists and ankles were bound to the wheelchair with straps. Both the walls and floors were padded with quilted square cushioning, and the door behind her had a slot in it, resembling something out of a mental hospital or maximum security prison. Just a second after the recording began, the bound woman raised her head and looked directly into the camera.
I immediately felt a growing sense of dread as the intense stare of the woman burned into my retinas. Some primal part of my brain awoke and implored me to get away. But I just watched as curiosity and fear mingled into an all-encompassing wave of building anxiety. The woman just sat in her chair staring, but I felt my mouth begin to dry and my breath felt abrasive. My sinuses burned, and soon I felt the patter of liquid onto my lap from my nose, but I couldn't turn away from the screen. I heard a rapid tapping, and it took a few seconds of trying to understand the sound before I realized it was the chattering of my teeth. I was shivering, and my arms and legs trembled as I watched the woman on the screen tilt her head to one side, as if observing me through the screen itself. That feeling of impending danger heightened, and I wanted to turn it off at that point, but I just kept watching as the woman began fidgeting in the wheelchair's restraints. She was becoming progressively more agitated, thrashing until the chair began to rock between the two large wheels. After a few minutes, she opened her mouth and began to scream. The tape was silent, but I swear I could hear her faintly, though not through the speakers. It was like she was screaming from inside my head, small and muffled, from deep under the folds of my brain. I felt my lips crack in stinging slivers. I began to wonder just how long I'd been watching the tape, but I was enthralled by the unsettling footage, unable to stop it. Eventually, the door to her room opened, and two large men in white uniforms entered her padded cell. One was shorter with a shaved head and stocky build, the other taller with a slender frame and a face framed by dark bangs. The tall man began holding his head in apparent agony, screaming and then dropping to his knees on the padded floor. He remained there as the shorter guy struggled to remove the cat from a syringe. I only then noticed the subtle relief my own body experienced. It was as if whatever had taken hold of me, the intense dryness in my throat, a pulsing headache and the palpable dread, had redirected its focus. The man on his knees began to shiver, and soon enough, his nose streamed down a dark rivulet of blood. The shorter character with a shaved head had uncapped the syringe but was clearly struggling. His right arm drew it closer, needle first, towards his own eye. His left was gripping his other wrist, struggling to redirect its course. I watched in horror as the tip punctured his eye, just a centimeter or so. He seemed to regain control and quickly removed it. He then stabbed the needle into the bound woman's shoulder and pressed the plunger fully down. The feeling of intensity seemed to wash away from both the on-screen characters and myself. Euphoria set in as my previous state of dry, labored breathing and chest pains left me. The two workers at the hospital, prison, or other such facility both seemed to recover as well, the one helping his cohort to his feet. The two men left the room, securing the sturdy door behind them. I watched for a few minutes as the woman in the wheelchair slouched and then dropped her head. She looked to be asleep, or at least heavily sedated. She remained that way for a good minute or two after the men had cleared out. I watched her slack body for a few more minutes in utter fascination, until the tape reached the end and stopped with an audible click. The intense anxiety dissipated completely, and I only then realized how absolutely drastic the shift in my own state had been. I felt as if I'd been desiccated, every ounce of water in me sucked out, yet my nose was wet and dribbling down my chin. When I wiped it instinctively with the back of my hand, I saw that it was blood. There were dark red spots on my lap as well from where it had poured during the viewing of the tape. I stood up, and my muscles ached and groaned. I glanced at my phone for the time, and stopped in my place, my jaw agape. The time read 6, the same time I started watching the tape. I was about to chalk it up to a glitch when it changed to 6:01. There was no shadow of a doubt in my mind that I'd watched the tape for a good 10 minutes or so. I stretched my aching muscles and walked to the bathroom to clean my bloodied nose. I downed a quart or so of water, dying of thirst. I waited a few days before even considering watching the tape again. When I did, everything that secured my knowledge of the world I knew seemed to crumble. It was a sunny afternoon a week later when I built up the courage to watch the tape again. I just felt the urge to confirm what I experienced was real and not some effect of delayed food poisoning, an allergic reaction, or some other bizarre coincidence. I popped the cassette tape and rewound it, which took only seconds. When I stopped, I pressed play. The woman bound to a wheelchair once again appeared on the screen, and a foreboding feeling of dread began to simmer inside of me. Something was different though. The woman was askew, facing the camera still, but at a slightly different angle, as if the wheelchair had shifted. On the floor behind her, black spots where the guard had yet to collapse were on the floor. It was as if the tape was showing a continuation of what had previously been recorded. My palms began to sweat, and my throat dried like an arid desert as I watched the woman staring into the camera once again. Her hair was shorter, trimmed down unevenly as if someone had hastily clipped the matted patches and knots. I knew it was impossible, but the tape appeared to be now showing a different recording altogether. Then, she looked up at the camera and I felt it again. My throat swelled and dried, and my breath began to burn. Her dark eyes locked onto mine through the screen. I felt a spasm in my arms and legs as they began to shiver. My sinuses flooded, and my nose began dribbling out a thin stream of blood, which dripped rhythmically onto my shirt. I watched, unable to peel my eyes away, as the woman in the wheelchair yanked her spindly arms, snapping her restraints. I let out a yell as she stood up fully, revealing her filthy hospital gown. She walked slowly toward the camera, and her wrinkles came into view through the fuzzy tape. Her features looked young, but her pale skin was wrinkled and speckled with burst capillaries. Her eyes were milky with cataracts and looked wild with excitement. She drew closer, getting larger on screen until her face was clear, and she mouthed something I swear I could hear inside of my head. She spoke the words, "Je te vois," and a hint of a smile crept onto her face before the tape clicked to a stop. I haven't yet worked up the nerve to watch it again. I bled a significant amount during the second viewing, and I'm frankly scared of the videotape. I attempted to make a copy, but it showed nothing but a black screen when I played it. I even tried recording it with my phone, but the TV screen in the video was black aside from a flicker. What I just can't shake are those words she'd spoken that resonated from deep within my skull. They're French, and they translate to, "I see you." This was when I was in 5th grade. I went with my best friend to her cousin's house for the day. They had a Ouija board that they wanted to play with. This was my first time even seeing one, so I didn't really know what to think. Nothing was scary. We sat around the board, asked questions for the spirits, laughed at how stupid it was and how boring it got real quick. I don't recall us saying goodbye or doing anything you're supposed to do when taking these boards seriously. One of the cousins felt uneasy, so we all gave up the game and went outside to play in the sprinkler, naturally. We come back into the house to eat. A cousin went into his bedroom, where the board and planchette were left lying on the floor, and found the board face up on the ceiling, as if someone had glued it there. They had bunk beds, so one of them climbed to the top bunk with a broom and tried scraping it off the ceiling, but it wouldn't budge. I don't really remember anyone being scared, or relating this to something paranormal. Honestly, at the time, I had no idea what the word meant, or what it would look like. We all thought it was weird as fuck, don't get me wrong, but no one felt scared. After failing to get the board off the ceiling, he gave up, and we searched the room for the planchette, finding nothing. We just went on with the day, leaving the room with the Ouija board stuck to the ceiling. The board did fall off the ceiling on its own in the middle of the night, but the planchette was never found. My friend and I left and went home that evening, without a care in the world. And that night, I was lying in bed about to go to sleep, but I was startled by the image projected onto the back of my eyelids whenever I would close them. Very simple, black periphery. In the middle looks like an open doorway with white light shining through. But in that doorway stood two men, one about a foot taller than the other, but both were just solid black, human figures with top hats. I know, first thing you'll think is Hatman, and maybe it was, but I'm not sure. Every single time I closed my eyes I would see them. I wasn't scared per se, more intrigued. It's like when you look at the sun for too long, then close your eyes. You can see all those colored specks. Except I was looking into the pitch black, then closing my eyes and seeing the same non-blurry image on my eyelids. Details about my young years. I was raised by a single alcoholic mom, so besides taking care of my brother, I was alone most of the time. I put alone in quotes because yes, I had friends, but my mind was much more developed and different than everyone else. I was alone in my thinking. We were very poor, so we didn't have television. For indoor fun, I would study the rip-off flashcards that come with my National Geographic magazines. The night in question, before laying in bed, I had learned the alphabet backward, then read some Moby Dick. I was that kid. Anyway, end of rant, back to story. So, I just kept opening and then closing my eyelids to see if the image would go away. I thought maybe my eyes were strained from either writing the alphabet backwards so much or reading with a flashlight under my sheets. I wasn't scared, but wondered if I should have been. I remember thinking, well, this is the way it is now. I guess I'll have to get used to it. And I fell asleep. The next day, I woke up like nothing and went to school and had a normal day. But bedtime came, and it wasn't until I closed my eyes and saw the two men on my eyelids that I remembered the night before. This night, I was more annoyed. Questions ran through my head. Does everyone see something when they try to sleep? Or are they there when I blink too? Again, I just kind of welcomed the new part of growing up I was annoyed with. This started in 5th grade and lasted until 6th grade, because I specifically remember going to bed one night and not seeing anything and thinking, wow, it's over. I thought it'd last forever. It wasn't until my middle school years, when I became fascinated with the paranormal, that I remembered this and thought it was definitely not normal. I always like to discount all options before concluding paranormal activity, but it irks me more that the event with the Ouija board happened the same day it started. Maybe something was trying to attach to me but couldn't. Maybe because I was more intrigued and annoyed than scared. I live in rural southern Nevada. A buddy of mine and I encountered what we decided to be a skinwalker one night while we were sharing a bottle of whiskey. It was late. I was living toward the edge of town, fairly close to the open desert. I don't remember the time. I'd estimate between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m. My buddy comes over and decides to spend the night drinking and hanging out with me. We were in the living room, sitting near the side of the house, right next to a couple closed and blinded windows. We'd been on the topic of the paranormal and cryptids when we began discussing skinwalker lore. We're about an hour in on that topic, and about a quarter into the fifth I had, swimmy but not quite drunk, when we began hearing a faint but distinguishable pitter-patter directly outside the window, pacing back and forth the length of the side of the house. We were buzzing enough to semi-dismiss it until we began to hear hyena-esque cackling. At that point, we figured that we had attracted one to us by speaking of them, which is a staple of their lore. So we decided the best course would be to not acknowledge it and carry on with our conversation until it left. The paw-like pacing and cackling continued for another 45 minutes or so, and eventually stopped. Neither one of us were willing to open the blinds or go outside until the morning. But when we woke up and went outside, not only did we see dog prints lining the dirt directly outside of the windows, we saw a set of abnormally large human-like footprints that ran from near the carport to the center of the yard before the track stopped dead, and each footprint was smaller and less imprinted. To this day, we're positive that we attracted or summoned a skinwalker. Even if that's not the correct cryptid, I know for a fact that there was something outside of the house that night. I was on a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay with about 7 other men doing a shakedown test cruise. We planned to be out for about 12 hours. It was the mid-80s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We got caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50-mile-per-hour range, just this short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails, because the one fellow on board who was the best sailor sensed the storm was almost on us. Otherwise, we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a securite call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom. No visibility, but then it passed, and we would live. This was at about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover, of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near landmasses, dredge a lot of things up from the seafloor. We're all on deck, working lines, checking damage, etc., and the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, "the sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, and then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape. Arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, and then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at that moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at that time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc., all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature, take my word for it? The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get a D-skipper or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooking onto the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a U.S. Navy captain with over 30 years experience in the surface Navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes, and then it went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said they had seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day, and didn't speak of it again. I was 15. I'm 40 now, so this happened a long time ago. I'd been asleep. It was a school night. I woke up feeling like my mouth was sandpaper dry. I went to the bathroom for water, and when I came out, I was facing my bedroom's west window. We lived on 16 acres, and only the space around the house was kept mowed. Everything else grew wild. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. The first thing I saw were the reflective eyes. Red. Not brilliant, like a red light shining. More muted, like a reflection. Only, there wasn't anything on that side of the house. I went to the window to see what could be out there, and I saw it. Standing perfectly still, where the yard edge met the tall brush. Standing slightly sideways, so I could see the front arm hanging down. Staring directly at me. Staring into my eyes. It didn't look like a deer standing on its back legs. We always saw deer around our property. This wasn't it. This was something else. I remember the fear that went through me. Overwhelming and hard to breathe because it was watching me. This was pre-internet, so I'd never heard of things like skinwalkers, but I knew what demonic meant, and this thing was definitely that. I could see its breath because it was a cold night, so there were clouds of condensation as it would exhale. Other than breathing, it didn't move for a solid 5 minutes. I remember stepping off to the side of my window, hoping to still see it, but did not see me. It didn't move and continued to stare at my window. After a bit, it turned and walked into the tall brush. It walked like a man, not like a deer standing on its back legs. I was shaking from fear and remember going to sleep in my older brother's room. He, of course, was annoyed with me the next morning and asked why I was in his room. I told him what I saw and described it in detail. After getting ready for school, we went outside to that side of the house. We could see the path the creature took away from the house. Just some brush that was pushed down as someone walked through grass that hadn't been touched in a long time and parted it. There were no hoof prints or anything. The brush was too tall and thick to see that. The brush was about my head height, about 5 foot. This thing stood a good 2 feet taller than that, because I could see its chest and head as it walked away. I asked my brother if he remembered this night, and he said he remembers it vividly. I've never seen this creature since. I've seen other odd things, but never anything like this.